All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here for the book talk today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two presenters. So first is Margaret Galvin, who's the author of Invisible Archives, Queer and Feminist Visual Culture in the 1980s. Margaret Galvin is Assistant Professor of Visual Rhetoric in the Department of English at the University of Florida. Her archivally informed research examines how visual culture operates within social movements and includes a first book, Invisible Archives, Queer and Feminist Visual Culture in the 1980s, out now with the University of Minnesota Press. In 2021 to 22, she was in residence at the Stanford Humanities Center as a Distinguished Junior External Fellow, researching a second book about how communities of LGBTQ cartoonists innovated comics through grassroots formats. Interviewing Margaret today is Allison Frazier, who is Associate Curator of the Poetry Collection and Coordinator of the Rare and Special Books Collection at the University of Buffalo. Her research on the materiality of 20th century poetics and literary archives has appeared in Information and Culture, JML, Journal of Modern Literature, RBM, a Journal of Rare Books, Manuscripts, and Cultural Heritage, and WSQ. Her archival recovery of female and queer poets includes the edited collections, The Collages of Helen Adam, and Nice Collected Poems by David Melnick. So welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here. And Margaret and Allison, whenever you two are ready.
Thanks, Catherine. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Dr. Margaret Galvin today about this phenomenal book that I think is very important in terms of changing the field of feminist and queer studies in the late 20th century, but also book history. So Margaret, if we wanted to get started with a basic question about a little bit about how this book came about. I would love to hear, how it was formulated and if you could give us a little bit of a background on the different topics that you talk about.
Great. So, when we're talking about feminist studies, we often talk a lot about, and there's been a lot of really great recovery of the 70s, and that's really important time period. When I started to look, I think this project started with some of the cartoonists, and they sort of they don't quite fit what we think as like these are the time periods. And they're actually very active in the 80s. And the 80s in some ways sort of gets, not ignored, but we talk a lot about the 70s and then we talk about the 90s when we talk about queer theory and the beginning of queer studies. And the 80s sort of gets left to the side. And so I wanted to really spend some time thinking about the 80s and thinking about all this really amazing work that lesbian feminists are doing in the 80s and put a lot of different forms together. Thinking about different visual print forms. So thinking about comics, but then not just thinking about comics, but putting them in conversation with other forms, like photos when they get printed in a book, or looking at someone who's very much known for her writing, like Gloria Anzaldúa, very well-known theorist. But the fact that she did drawings that she used during her talks and she would project during her talks and reanimate them with her hand as she went through her talks is not something that we discuss. And so finding different ways to highlight visual materials and to think about how those allowed women in this time period to think about their sexuality, to think about their bodies, and to build community with each other was something that it sort of developed over the course of many years, over the course of writing grants and going to archives and doing this research, because a lot of this stuff also isn't something I can pick up off the library shelf. And so that sort of became a necessity. And so thinking about then what role does the archive play in this, both in the moment, there are artists who are inspired by and use materials from the archives in their artwork. Like the collage artist I talk about in the first chapter, who sort of sourced things in New York Public Library from lesbian history archives and put together these really beautiful collages that are become very controversial around representing sort of pornographic bodies. But then also a lot of this material, because it's rare, it's small print, it's doesn't circulate very much beyond, becomes sort of in the archives, and how are they collected there? Who remembers them now? How can we reactivate them? All those sorts of questions become really important to me. So those are some of the things that were happening in the book, but it took a long time to write, and a lot of places to go and look at these things, because I really wanted to get a sense of how things were, collected across many archives. So when I went and did some of the first initial research on some of these feminist comics, I wanted to not just go to one place where they're collected, but go to multiple places where they're collected and see how they're collected differently. And also because, places don't have full print runs. So I have to, by virtue of their rareness, I do have to go to many places to be able to see more of them.
You remember how many archives you went to?
I mean, it's like a dozen, if not. I have a whole list on my website, so I kept track. I like to think about all the different places I went, but some of them were like, I'd be home for Christmas in Los Angeles, and I went to Cal State Long Beach for a day because one of my artists went to undergrad there, and so I wanted to see what sort of information I could find about that was in her school newspaper from the 70s. So some of them were small trips, but some of them were like, I went back to Ansel Dua's archives at UT Austin twice and spent several weeks there.
Yeah, it's an incredible, labor to travel and to visit all those archives for this book. And thank you so much for that kind of introduction to your beginning feelings about how this book came together and the general themes, because I'm going to ask you many questions about many of the things you just mentioned. So I think I'd like to start by talking about how the artists that you talk about use word and image together to create constellations of queer life in the 1980s. Visibility in print, of course, is so important for underrepresented minority populations, and for queer folks in particular. Visual representation brings queerness kind of out of the closet by activating it. Visibility activates that expression. And the visual and the textual documentation of the diverse bodies and sexualities discussed throughout your book speak to the need in queer communities to document and archive their own diversity and claim space. So from comics like The Further Fattening Adventures of Pudge Girl Blimp by Lee Mars, that was not a comic that I was familiar with, but I was so fascinated by your discussion of her work, to Nan Goldin's photographs witnessing the HIV/AIDS crisis. Can you talk about the different ways that visual representations operate across media in the works you discuss?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the pleasures and also the difficulties of writing about different kinds of media. You have to think about the different approaches that they're taking. So someone like Nan Goldin has a more direct approach where she's photographing people, and these are these people, and she's going to identify them. And that sort of identification is really important to make sort of clear how large her community is. All of these community of lovers and artists and everyone in between who are sexually liberated. Also, then it becomes something for her to sort of reflect on as HIV/AIDS starts to ravage the community, and she sort of changes the story of how she's reading those photographs over the people's lives. But then we have artists who are not necessarily directly representing specific people. Thinking about the comics here. But are representing the sort of the truth of their life in comics form. So I call those things semi-autobiographical. So in some cases, you have main characters that are somewhat avatars for the artists, but it really allows them freedom to represent, but also freedom to represent without worrying about outing anyone, compromising anyone's safety, any of those things. They can sort of safely represent the community in a way that allows them to be out, but also protects them from, someone sort of finding out who that person is. Of course, these things are also circulating within queer community spaces as well. Also, comics are something that people see as fun little asides. Often they got clipped out. People talk about clipping them out, putting them on their refrigerator, if it's a comic strip. And so there's a sense that it's like fun and accessible and light, but then it's also dealing with some very like deep things, talking about homophobia in the community, talking about being misgendered. There's some early comics by Alison Bechdel where her character is using the women's restroom and people are calling out her right to be there. And so there's a way in which comics sort of, because they're not really seen as comics, seen as funny, seen as light, but then they can also sort of represent queerness in a different way and sort of a different level of discussion, right? Rather than, these photographs, which also went between different sort of spaces, right? They were on museum walls, but they were also broadcast in bars among friends. And so they had sort of more travel, and in some ways also Nan Goldin's photographs, as much as we love them today, at the time, especially because they were in color, they weren't seen as sort of high art, because a lot of they weren't in black and white. They didn't, the tone that they were taking, what they were representing, she got a lot of flack for that. And so there's a way in which all of these artists in their own way are sort of formally innovative or pushing back against the forms in which they're working with and doing something different with them.
Thank you. I think, for me reading this this book and hearing what you just had to say about representation and, specific people in photographs versus comics that have, somebody is not a particular person, it's just an imagination of somebody. One of the pieces that you analyzed I thought was so interesting in terms of your argument just now was, I think it was Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For, like an earlier version of the strip where she has a couple of different writers, the late night writer, the early morning writer, of course, late night writer has, the bottle of booze on the table and is, stressed out. And the early morning one is, the type A person. And then you point out that when she revisits that strip later, that she's inserted some of the characters that readers would now know as being part of Dykes to Watch Out For. And so there's this interesting way that she's creating a comic community within the strip, which I think is pretty fascinating. And I was also really interested in your work on Nan Goldin and what you had just said about her photographs, because I think that's a really important part of the entire book. Her photographs now we see as being legitimate, or photography in general as being a legitimate field of study. But as you just pointed out, that's not always the case. And as you point out in the book, comics are still operate in that space in academia of, are they a legitimate, topic worthy of study? So this might be a good place to talk about the relationship between the objects that you discuss, the comics, the collages, these other kind of ephemeral book objects, and the larger field of book history and how they fit in with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think
small topic, I know.
Yeah, like I could go so many different directions. I mean, I do think this is definitely a book history project, thinking about the context in which these books were made. Also, thinking about often in literary studies, we think about singular authors, right? We're very much like, the artist is genius. And then when you sort of start to look at book studies and sort of think about how a book is made, you start to think about like the many hands involved. And so that was something that was very important to me, to think about the many hands involved, in the creation of the newspaper, where Alison Bechdel first published her comic strips, or when she started sending her strips out other places, she would send them with like instructions like that were printed around the comic, saying like, you can cut it up these different ways if you want to make it vertical, if you want to make it horizontal. And so even thinking of the person who cut it up and made that decision on how to lay it out, she herself was also invested in cut up, paste up, and doing all that sort of labor. So she knew how it worked. And so she knew she wanted to have that. So those people, but also the people who are writing in, places would have to fundraise to be able to pay her. So she would get conversations about that. People would like write her letters about the characters. So there's all these different ways that there were these many moments of these many people involved that ultimately shaped the work. And she's a really great example, because she's been seen as this very singular genius. She won a Guggenheim, she won a MacArthur, but it's really all of these collective investments that really make the comic strip possible, and all these places where she's publishing that give her the insight to know what to do with her characters, to represent queer life in a way that feels authentic, in a moment before we really have internet and we have a way to really get a sense of what's happening, on any corner of the US, because she's publishing in all these different venues. And, similarly, Alondel Dua is another sort of very like major figure. And she's giving like 12, 13 talks a year, like lots of talks. And she's always bringing these drawings with her as another way to welcome people into her textual thought, and a way to sort of animate her thought differently, and a way to also get people to think about themselves and their own subjectivities, and think about how they might represent that maybe in words, but maybe in drawing, maybe in images. And so these different ways of, bringing folks together, but also recognizing sort of the importance of all of these things. So for me, like the collectivity is part of it. The emphasis on materiality, how things get made, is another part of it. Recognizing that these artists were also very much invested in the labor of putting these things together, of drawing these slides. They're sort of invested many points along the way. And so I think that's different than sort of more traditional literary studies, where we are more interested in plot and narrative and sort of things contained within the book, and not really looking at sort of the book as it exists along these many planes.
I want to spend some time unpacking many different threads that you just brought up, but one I just wanted to just mention to everybody who is not familiar with the Gloria Anzaldúa drawings that Margaret was just mentioning and hasn't read the book. These are on transparencies, if you recall, being in a classroom environment. And so they are, with markers, and as you write in the book, they could be easily erased. And I believe you described receiving them at UT Austin in a folder, kind of stacked together. Is that right?
Yeah,
it's
there's
just the most horrifying part of the book to me.
There was no protective, like, sort of papers between any of them. Also, I will say that all the pictures, there's 65, I want to say, in the book, are all black and white in the book, but they're all scaled in a way, and I was very particular about this, so they could all be readable in the book. But they are also the book is open access online. So if you click the link that takes you to the page where the book's on the Minnesota website, which Catherine linked for us, you can then click to the Manifold edition, which is a digital open access book, and all of the images there are in color, which is most important for the last 2 chapters, where the images are in color. And so you can see the drawings in color, and the different color transparency pens. So I wanted to mention that people want to like look at them. They're really beautiful.
Well, I think, one of the many reasons why I love this book is that you are both introducing me to authors I don't know, and then you're introducing me to authors that I do know, like Anzaldúa, to a completely different side of her work I had no idea was there. And I think that's really important. And of course, the person who works in libraries in me is freaking out about, I work with ephemeral things all the time, but a transparency. God bless them at UT Austin. But so I want to talk a little bit more about the archives and how these authors, especially, particularly Bechtel and Anzaldúa, are working within the archives. And the visual representations of queer life and feminist sexuality that you discuss are often drawing on the archives. It's interesting when you read the book that you talk about the lesbian her story archives, for instance, in Brooklyn. Sometimes you'll talk about them because the authors you're talking about went there and are using texts from there for their thing that you are now talking about. And sometimes it's you going to that archive and looking at the object. So there's this really interesting movement within archives in this book that we'll approach from a couple of different angles. But I was interested right now in thinking about Alison Bechdel's preservation of, and here I'm quoting you, the social movement around her that otherwise might not have been saved. In other words, lesbian history in the 1980s and into the 90s, which documents the context from which and to she wrote, as you were just describing, as well as Gloria Anzaldúa's community talks with her, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, GIFLO drawings on the transparencies you were just describing, which could be very easily erased. And most people who created these types of transparencies did erase them. Can you talk about how these authors create archives as they engage with them?
Yeah, so the Anzaldúa and the Bechtel chapter are sort of like at the center of the book. And I do talk a lot about how both authors themselves, were creating, were like saving a whole bunch of stuff from the movement as they were also creating these works. There was a sense of, if we don't save this, it might not be saved. There was a sense of, this is stuff that we are actively drawing upon. I'm sure 100% that the other artists did that, but the other artists didn't have, this is so-and-so's papers, let me go visit so-and-so's papers. So I had to have different tactics for, thinking about their archival investments. But you can see this, in sort of the collections that Bechdel's and Ansel do is how they were very deliberate about saving things and not only documenting their own work, but also documenting the larger work of the community and the social movements around them. I think at one point in the Ansel Dua chapter, I sort of do just like a quick, like, let me count the number of folders that are, her manuscripts versus the things that are more collective. And there's, I think I say there's just as many, if not more, of things that are sort of documenting sort of this larger space around them. And so, that's, I think, super important to think about, that these women are also building these collections at the same time that there are collections being built that we sort of are well known today as being important grassroots archives of LGBTQ life and very foundational. And so they would have been aware of that, but they would have been aware that their materials might not be ones that would be saved somewhere like at a university. And yet now they are, right? Like Alison Bechdel's collection is at the Sophia Smith collection. I talk about a YouTube video that she made where she's like going through and joyfully picking things out to send to the archive because she sees it as a way to save space because she has filing cabinets everywhere. So she's going to ship off some of her old stuff and then she's going to have more room to make more things.
That's a great video, by the way, just for everybody to watch because it's not very long. But if you work in archives and you're used to seeing, you're used to receiving an archive in a nice box and folder, it's nice to see it before it arrives at that stage.
Yeah, and then Gloria Anzaldua's archives are at UT Austin. They're at the Benson, which is a Latin American collection. That's sort of fitting, but also funny because I also talk about in the chapter how she left UT Austin and didn't finish her doctorate because she tried all these different fields of study, feminist studies, women's studies, like Latinx, Chicanx, and she was told these are not legitimate fields of study. And so she left and, she went and eventually did a doctorate elsewhere. But she was like, well, I'm going to create the things that you say that we don't have enough of. She did this bridge called My Back, Borderlands La Frontera, but she did that sort of like outside of the bounds of academia. So for her to be at UT Austin is a little bit ironic. But the anecdote that I love that I heard when I was there is that originally when she passed, she's all the other artists are living. She's no longer living. Someone called, Ransom, the big archives on campus, well known, the people who are at the top. I once read an article how they sort of see themselves as football coaches in terms of recruiting archives. Like it's important business, right, at Texas. And they didn't know how Anzaldua was, so they called the Benson, and the Benson's like, okay, she's really important, but also let us have that one. You don't get to have that one. You don't even know who she is. And in fact, now she's a jewel of their collection, and they have a fellowship reserved for if you want to do research on her work, you can get that fellowship specifically. And so that's sort of what first brought me to her archives, is getting that fellowship and being able to go and do this research, right? All these very small grants, I think, are it would not be possible with all the different sources of funding from different places and being able to see the stuff in person. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, that the tension that's there between Anzaldua and her inability to complete a PhD at UT Austin, and then now that it's one of the key collections in the archive is really interesting. And throughout the book, you talk a lot about the various community and institutional archives that you work with to complete this work. And so you've kind of already talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to spend maybe a little bit more time talking about that relationship. You cite for both in the book, you work with archivists and memory workers who work in both types of archives. As you write in the introduction of your overview of queer archival collections that are now in institutions like the one National Gay and Lesbian Archives, the June L. Mazur Lesbian Archives, or the new Alexandria Library for Women. All of these began as personal collections and often, as you say, in their homes. So very, intimate setting for the archive that we now experience as being very public. And as you were just describing, sometimes the transition from, grassroots community archive to institutional archive is not always straightforward. Ansel Duos was a good example of that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, because we've kind of mentioned it, but not really focused on it, the Diary of a Conference on Sexuality, because this is how, you open the book, the first chapter, and it's such an interesting study of the relationship of Barnard College, which was hosting this series. This was the 9th conference on sexuality, right? And this incredible conference program that came out of it. And as you describe in the book, it was censored, and Barnard College decided that they did not want the official seal on it. As somebody who needs to work with trademarks and licensing, sometimes I can appreciate the difficulty that the editors and the creators had in this conversation. But now, of course, this censored document lives in the archives. Could you talk a little bit about how that conference program, which is kind of like a collage, it's a diary, it's a lot of different things. It's a really interesting document, came about, and how the creators kind of pictured it living in the world, which is not exactly how it was able to live in the world, because it was distributed to the conference participants only after the conference, and its relationship with the archives.
Yeah, I love this. This is the first chapter. This is also the image on the cover comes from this piece. And it's something that gets mentioned a lot, but only as it gets mentioned. So people will say, hey, there was this conference at Barnard, it's long running Feminist and Scholar, and then they want to do one on sexuality. And it became very controversial. There was at this time the beginnings of what we call the feminist sex wars, and people had different positions on pornography. If it constituted violence against women, they had different ideas about BDSM sex practices within sort of the community. And so there were some people who were on one side and on the other side. And so the sort of the anti-porn, anti-BDSM feminists said, are you sure this is appropriate for a scholarly conference? And so they didn't stop anyone from speaking. So even the people who there were specific people like Gail Rubin, like Dorothy Allison, who's a well-known novelist, but who's also involved with the lesbian sex mafia. I love that the name of the group is great. Who were targeted, but they were allowed to speak, but they censored this document, the Diary of the Conference on Sexuality. There was also every year they did like your typical program, but here they wanted to do the diary because they knew this was a controversial topic, and they wanted to make visible for everyone the conference planning. So there were entries that were styled as Dear Diary, but they were like the meeting minutes for the planning committee, and there were like 24-ish, I forget exactly the exact number, women who were involved. And so they wanted to make those visible, and they also wanted to sort of have a stylized conference program. And the images themselves weren't pornographic at all. It was actually quite tame. When Judith Butler received a copy months later, they wrote in Gay Community News that they were surprised and shocked that this was the thing that got censored. But it gets censored, and then when people mention it, they'll mention it, and then no one actually takes the time to actually look at it, even now. And so it's very interesting because these artists, they were not scholars. Mary Beth Nelson, Beth Jaker, and Hannah Alderfair, they were graphic artists, graphic designers. They had also worked with earlier Heresies issue. Heresies is a feminist art publication that dealt with issues of sexuality. They were working on that. They later become involved again with sort of feminists against censorship. And so they work on a second volume, which actually then they are sourcing actual pornography, but it's not sort of outside the bounds of academia, so they can do that. And they make a volume called Caught Looking. And so I'm sort of looking across that, and sort of, it's sort of funny, Barnard removes all of this, there is a image where they have a letter and it's on Barnard letterhead, so they have to remove the letterhead. There's a page that describes the Barnard Women's Center, and they eventually just sort of make a blank page. I saw the page where they were trying to edit it and like figure out how to edit it down so it'd be okay, and they're like, no, we can't. They do all of this, and it really, it's so when people go to the conference on that day, they don't receive that at all. They actually receive all the protest pamphlets from the people who are protesting the conference. And it does have like a really negative impact on the people involved, who sort of get called out. Even when I wanted to go see their records, originally they said to me, I think you can see them, but let's go check with some people because there are still really hard feelings about this conference. And one of the first versions I saw before I saw that, my dissertation director was actually one of the women who was involved in planning the conference, Nancy K. Miller. And so I had her own little personal copy, which I believe is an uncensored copy, if I remember correctly. I've seen so many copies across the years because they were able to save some copies when they were being confiscated because they had already been printed. Yeah, so a real big debacle, and it's just really interesting to think about sort of these larger forces that want to censor, and sometimes they're coming from within the movement as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great story because it does deal with, forces against, expression from the community, but also at this institutional pressure to kind of clamp down and have a particular perspective. I want to maybe change gears a little bit and go back to, again, the idea of reading across archives, because you make this really beautiful argument that within the archival methodology of going to these different institutions and grassroots archives, that led you to see that where an archival object ends up contextualizes its meaning for the researcher in a really meaningful way. And I think, there's a lot there that I think is very important. But if you'll humor me, of course, I needed to read across one more archive, which is the one I work for. And while the majority of the books that the authors you discuss in this book are not represented in the poetry collection or are not discoverable, maybe they are here and I just don't know. One object in particular I thought really spoke to some of the themes and conversations that you talk about. And it is, I'm not going to pull out my document camera, but it is this exhibition catalog by Nan Goldin from 1991 titled Cookie Mueller. And it includes a short introduction by Nan Goldin, which is handwritten with underscoring the intimacy with the reader. And then it's, as you can see, very thin exhibition catalog, select photographs of Cookie Mueller. And as you write in the book, Mueller, of course, star of John Waters films, and that's how most people know her, important figure in the 1980s New York scene, writer in her own right, but also who passed away from AIDS. Was it in 1989? Shortly after the death of her husband from AIDS as well. And so you write really beautifully in the book about the relationship between Nan Goldin and many of her subjects, including Cookie Mueller, and the way that Nan Goldin is able to bring us, the viewer, into this very intimate space with her subjects. And this exhibition catalog that we have in the poetry collection is a really wonderful, it helps kind of expand my understanding of what you were talking about in the book when you were writing about the photographs of Cookie Mueller. It includes a lot of intimate pictures of her with her former partner, Sharon Nesbitt. And it also, it concludes with a final letter from Mueller to Nan Goldin that describes the devastation of the AIDS epidemic, both in terms of people lost and the silence enforced around it, which, is a key part of your argument about, the important, political work that Nan Goldin is doing through these photographs. And this letter I thought was incredibly interesting because Mueller describes a friend of hers who had been admitted to the hospital for complications related to AIDS. And he writes to her and he says explicitly, I don't want you to visit me because he's much worse visually than he was when she saw him last. And of course, this is contrasted by the entire exhibition catalog that we just saw, and the relationship between Goldin and Mueller, and highlighting the visual through Goldin's photographs, and even underscoring Mueller's absence. So, for instance, there's a shot of her in her open casket or an empty couch over Christmas the year she passed away. In terms of contextualization, you also mention in the Witnesses book that Nan Goldin had about the AIDS epidemic,
Send messages to your provider.
the introduction has a photograph of Cookie Mueller by her husband's open casket, and now it's in a different context. So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about how, maybe particularly Golden, but in general, the authors you discuss grapple with the discomfort of making visible something that society deems shouldn't be seen. And alternatively, thinking about the relationship between the personal and the private in the work that you analyze.
It's really cool that you have that piece. As I understand, it's pretty rare because it's like, a catalog for an exhibit. And Cookies, it was sort of one of her very best friends. And so, the as you say, the document sort of shows photos across her whole life, right? And it sort of also tracks Golden's own development as a photographer, which is really interesting. But yeah, no, Golden is very much about making public private lives of, people who are beyond heterosexual, right?
Mhm.
Mueller was bisexual. Golden herself is bisexual. And so she is really interested. She has photos of herself where she'd set up a tripod, and there are photos of her very intimate sexual situations. And she wanted to sort of, cast off the taboo of shame around these things, right? And really make visible these parts of people's lives, and to not feel shame about them, and to sort of leave that stigma behind. One of the things that she cites as her origin story and sort of got her photographing in the first place is, when she was young, her older sister, who felt very repressed and wanted to rebel, but sort of was unable to, um, killed herself, committed suicide. And Golden runs away from home and starts photographing. And she says in the introduction to the textual version of The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, which is sort of her major work that I talk about, one of the things I talk about in the chapter, that she didn't want to lose the memory of anyone else again because she couldn't remember what her sister looked like. And she includes a photo that is very unlike her own photos, and you can't really see her sister Barbara at all, her face. And so her photos, by contrast, really get a sense of the person by photographing them again and again and again, and not really shying away from these hard situations. One of the photos that's also very well known is actually not a photo that she took, but she had her friend take. She was dating someone who was really terrible and very domestically abusive, and he was very angry and went after her eyes because she's a photographer, and she had to have emergency eye surgery to save her vision. And she had one of her best friends, take a photo of that, and it was for her to remind herself never to go back to him. So these are very emotionally, often very private things, but for Nan Golden, it's her sense of a visual. She uses the word diary, right, which echoes what we have, the diary at the very beginning of the book. There was a sense also, you have someone like Alison Bechdel. When she's making her comics, and she's really like interested in like representing like lots of characters that represent all sorts of facets of like lesbian life. She makes the point that there were, people were writing, sort of thinking about, Audrey and Rich said, lesbians have been erased from history, that sort of thing. And so it's like people are writing, and they're starting to be, photographs a little bit, but we didn't really have enough of a visual record. So there was a sense that we need to create a visual record to say that we're here. And also, this is how our lives are, on our own terms, right? And not on the terms of what mainstream media will say about us. And also, in a time where there's a lot of silence about HIV/AIDS, there's a lot of people don't want to talk about it, right? And the exhibit that Nan Golden curates, Witnesses Against Our Vanishing, which is the second thing I talk about in the book, it almost gets censored as well, not because of the visuals. Interestingly, I guess it's never the visuals. It's always something, this is the writing is very inflammatory against politicians, against Jesse Helms. Surprise, surprise. Anyone who knows Jesse Helms knows he's a piece of shit. So, and he was a piece of shit to gay people in the 80s. And so they almost censor remove the funding for that. And so they find a way to find alternate funding for that book, to get that essay by David von Rovich printed. And the exhibit goes on. And in some ways, the front page news about that whole debacle, which is, broadcast nationwide, brings like record numbers of people into the gallery. So, no news is bad news, right? But yeah, so these sorts of things, these artists are very committed to making visible, right? But there's also that, my title is a pun, Invisible Archives, 3 words, right? To play with that sense that this visibility for queer people is always tenuous, always is never guaranteed. Grassroots archives are great, but they don't always have the ability to say that things will be preserved long term. So they're here for the present, but how long are they here for? How can we save them? Things are in university archives, but when laws are changing in places, do we need to worry about their safety long term in those places? So yeah, lots of thoughts and lots of ways this felt very, very, very contemporary. Some of these things as laws became more constrictive where I live.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is one of the aspects that makes this book so critical, because it speaks very much to our contemporary moment, as well as the 80s. So I have so many more questions for you. I think I could hold you here all afternoon, but I do want to pause and open up the floor for Q&A, which I believe Catherine will be helping us moderate. But I think you could either raise your hand and we'll call on you, or drop a question in the chat. And if folks want to take a minute to gather their thoughts, I can continue asking questions too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Margaret and Allison. And just to follow up on that, you're welcome to raise your hand, or if you put a question in the chat, then I'll read it out for you.
Well, maybe while people are getting their questions together, I can ask one more question. If you could speak maybe briefly about this, because I really loved this idea, of course, as somebody who works in a special collections library. You advise readers to stop thinking about archives as places where materials have been, and here I'm going to quote from you, deposited just once. Rather, you must consider how these materials circulate back and forth between archives and individuals who repurpose them for new art and thought. Can you talk a little bit more about the life cycle of the archives and the researchers' role in it? One anecdote that came out of the book that I loved was from the Lesbian Her Story archives and their comic book collection. When you first visited, it was kind of in an upper floor and kind of inaccessible. And then in a much more recent visit, it's now on a mobile cart on the first floor, much more present to researchers. So I'd love to hear more about the role of the researcher in the life cycle of the archival objects that we encounter.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, when I was also, I was talking a lot early about collective investment, and this is something I also think of too, is, I have my own ego, but trying to take my own ego out of it and recognizing that everything I see is made visible and possible because of the people who've been working in the collections, who in some ways are continuously thinking about, how do we process this for people to see? I mean, Alison Bechdel's materials, as I worked with them, I went back on 2 occasions. They were still in the stage of being processed.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, there were things I could see that were not processed, but with her artwork, the way it was given to them was in these large tubs, and it was just stacked one on top of the other. And so they had to go through down level by level by level and then refolder those things. And so they couldn't let someone access that unprocessed, right? And so on the second visit, I got to see a lot of things I couldn't see on the first visit because of that. But, I think of, researchers as it's important to develop good relationships with the archivists and talk to folks. Talk about what you're interested in. Sometimes there are things that are unprocessed in the back catalog. Sometimes also there are things I would see because I know the material and I was able to identify people who are not identified. or give them some information about this material. Or I went, did some research for a new project about LGBTQ cartoonists this summer at the Schlesinger. And they said that one of the reasons they brought me in and gave me some money to come was because they didn't realize a comic that they held was so rare. And I was like, yes, it's super rare. I haven't seen it in many years of knowing about it. And then I was able to, because it was sort of part of a collection of the publisher, find out why it was so rare and find out that it wasn't the record was in, they didn't publish it, they distributed it, and they decided that they didn't have any more room for it to be distributed, and they asked the artists to reclaim their comics and couldn't get a hold of the artist. And so the last memo says, if we don't hear back from you, we're going to destroy all these copies. And so that's all, they're going to recycle them, right? We're just destroying them. And so I think that's what happened, is these thousands of copies of this comic were destroyed. And so it's thinking about the things, it's really a miracle, the things that I studied, that they actually were able to survive and reach people. And then the archive then allows them to reach again. And so one of the collections, grassroots collections that I take a lot from in thinking about this idea that you sort of articulated, that I write about, is the Interference Archive in Brooklyn, with their social movement archive, and their idea is preservation through use. So how do we make this stuff able to get into hands of, for them, activists today, so they can draw upon what has happened in activism before, and then use it again and make it new, and continue the fight for social justice. And so for me, that's something that's really important. And a lot of people I was in conversation with who are really critical. I'm thinking of Kate Eichhorn, the Archival Alternative Feminism. I'm thinking of Maria Cotera's work with the Chicana por mi Raza project. They're really interested in archives as a space of knowledge production, something where some things can continue to happen, right? And there can be especially intergenerational exchange.
Thank you. And in the chat from Natalie asks, could you talk more about how your project pressures the study of comics from a queer studies perspective and vice versa? I'd love to hear more about the stakes of your project for both of those fields. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. I mean, so comic studies has not traditionally been a place where we talk a lot about LGBTQ creators. But there's been there's been a huge amount of publishing of queer comics, especially, after Fun Home, after a bunch of comics made it big, and queer comics have been very hot to publish. And so contemporarily, they're very available. And so we also then have a lot of people who are now starting to change the field and start to talk about these things. And there's been a number of special issues and publications around comics that are queer. We don't yet have enough, and this is what I'm trying to do, enough of that history. And some of that is accessibility. A lot of these things are not very accessible. And not enough attention to comics as this is sort of the periodical studies angle. You didn't ask about that, but not enough attention to LGBTQ comics as they appear in grassroots periodicals. We just don't have that conversation. That's something I'm trying to get people started on, especially as some of these periodicals are being digitized. It doesn't make it easy to find the comics, but it does mean that they're more accessible. And then from queer studies, in feminist studies and women's studies, certainly there have been folks who have talked about these comics, especially folks who are reading them at the time. And I can find, articles from the 90s on them, but there hasn't been as much of a women's studies, especially likes to talk about zines. Zines is sort of like, they love the zines. But the comics don't get talked about as much. There is more space now today. I mean, I think these things are changing. Hilary Schute's Graphic Women, which was published in 2010. I got to see that chapters from that before it's published, because my advisor, Nancy K. Miller, was one of the people who edited the series that came out in. And so I think that book is very influential in sort of bringing more attention to comics, seeing them as something that could be very serious for serious study, and thinking about how it's not just for boys, and it can have sort of a angle that is important for queer studies and women's studies, and thinking about how, for me, I think this is very important too, is I'm not just theorizing these works myself or from the basis of what scholars have said, but letting the artists themselves. I read lots of interviews with them, thinking about their own work as sort of visual theory too, right? Like Alison Bechdel is a very smart person, right? And so thinking about how these things, how they theorize them in interviews, but also how the work itself theorizes and what it can add to the discourse of queer studies from the art itself. Thanks for the question.
And Shannon also asks in the chat, late 80s through mid 90s, Cleese Press published cartoonists like Diane DeMassa and Jennifer Camper. This is when Cleese was an independent publisher. Margaret, from your research, did such artists pull away from publishing because of aversion to potential acquisition by established/large publishers? Also, thank you for today.
Yeah, so there's a huge lesbian comics boom in the 90s, but it happens a lot in these very small press places. Like Cleese Press is a really good example. And so some of these people are not necessarily interested in finding a larger publisher. There's, constraints on, how your work, well, there's constraints on how you can represent your work when it goes to a larger publisher, but then also even today, my friend Justin Hall, who's done a lot of really great work, he'll be told like, this story is parochial, is it universal, or like, is a queer story about this thing universal enough to reach enough readers if it's a mainstream publisher? And so I think there is some concern, or there's some difficulty getting published with bigger publishers because is this universal enough to reach enough people? And so in the 90s, also, in addition to publishing with all these small feminist presses, and sometimes, the comics were what was funding the presses, like very in Firebrand Books, which Bechdel published with, which is based out of Ithaca, they would talk about the sale of her comics, like supporting the ability to publish lesbian poetry, which didn't sell as many copies, but they, in some ways the comics are subsidizing that. But they also publish a lot of stuff in zines where they are their own editors. It is not commercial. It's about being able to circulate it and read it on their own terms. And so I think those are some of the places where you see this work. And then that's why some of the stuff is harder to access or write about today, because of the decisions that these artists made in terms of where to publish and circulate them at the moment. And so then archives become really important. Anything else we have?
I have more. If there isn't, I wondered if you could talk about, you mentioned this very briefly in the epilogue, about teaching these objects. And can you talk about how you've used them in the classroom? Any suggestions that you have for other folks who might want to teach these? Because if we're talking about community, our students are absolutely part of that. You have this great project that you describe about creating Wikipedia pages, or your students create Wikipedia pages for female comic book makers who otherwise don't have an internet presence, as a way of, one way of archiving them and continuing their memory. So I just love to hear about your students' interactions with the type of print media you talk about.
Yeah, so the Wikipedia project is one I do every so often. Wiki EDU, the Wikipedia sort of education arm, they actually have a whole platform that you can use, and they sort of also pair you with a Wikipedia expert who helps your students. And so especially if you're at an under-resourced public institution, it's nice that there's a tool that also includes support for you to be able to do this project and be able to has tutorials so students learn how to edit Wikipedia. And students actually will report to me that they do a lot more research because they're very invested in it, because it's public. But as I actually mentioned, I think in the footnote, the last time I did this with some queer cartoonists, a bunch of the new sort of the writing, an entry for someone who hasn't been represented, a lot of them were flagged and actually taken down as not notable enough. Right. And are they not notable enough? Or, and I think my students had done there seemed to necessarily not be a rhyme or reason why they're taken down. But, someone asked me once, like, well, what happens when you run out of cartoonists to do Wikipedia for? And I was like, oh, well, there's tons of cartoonists. And now my answer is like, well, there's tons of cartoonists, but also sometimes we need to do it twice or 3 times to make it stick. And so, you know, there's been some work with that. I've also had students do digital exhibits where they're learning how to edit WordPress. And also they're in that I always did that with women cartoonists. And one of the things there is to also recognize the amazing amount of research that has been done in this field from also cartoonists. Cartoonists are some of the best researchers of their own art form because they've been ignored. And so to have students draw upon those resources when building the exhibit, right? And so I find ways to make the material active, but also for students not just be writing papers to each other, but to be doing something more public. So I taught zines last semester, and they made zines that were responding to the things that we were reading, and they would circulate the zines with each other. And the last thing, they had to make a zine for every single person in the classroom. And so then also having them understand the form by engaging in making the form, I think is important. But also I'm from a literature I'm in a literature department. I'm not in an art department. And so I also say, you know, like, look, we're not looking for technical perfection, but zines aren't about technical perfection too. So it works. So, you know, lots of different ways to get students invested in, you know, sort of tricking them into doing more research, and like, because they get really, you know, someone might be reading this. This is important. And I had some students also, I think it's coming out soon. Some students took a step further when we were doing the Wikipedia, and they actually reached out to some of these artists and interviewed them, like over email, or because they were trying to like learn more to put in the Wikipedia articles. And so we're actually publishing those. And one of them is actually, the artist was talking with her like was fall of 2022, and actually disclosed to my student that she was actually had terminal illness, and she was dying. And it was very powerful for her because she is someone who is, you know, hardly gotten very much attention at all, for her to share these things, and also for her to go into her own personal collection, actually share comics I didn't know about, you know, that she had published when she was young in Hong Kong, and to be able to make this all, you know, visible again. And so, you know, we're publishing that, and this person's no longer with us, and there's not very much, you know, material on there about Hope Barrett, about her really important work with O, which was a Canadian lesbian bisexual women cartoonist series throughout the 90s. But it's really great to be able to sort of hear her voice. And so sometimes this work has, you know, students do something that's even beyond what I imagined they might do.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. Any final questions from Margaret? We're at the end. Catherine's unmuted.
I think we have time for maybe one more short question if anybody has one. And if not, then I will say thank you so much to everybody for coming today. Thank you, Margaret and Allison. And if you would like to attend the next book party, it will be on February 27th, where author Marissa Nicosia and Andrew Bricker will be talking about Marissa's book, Imagining Time in the English Chronicle play. So more details to be announced on that. And thank you everybody for being here today.